because we all know that our instructions for use are not always that great, and they are very complex, but it's that kind of interpretation that we're missing for, I think, a lot of the sterile processing techs that are just doing the day in, day out. And so that's where we may have to help them as educators, managers, and other roles to be able to kind of make it easier for them to understand what it actually is calling out in those specific IPs.
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal: to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
All right, Clean Freaks, welcome back to another episode of the Beyond Clean podcast. You're listening to season 33, Built Different, a season all about training and education of sterile processing technicians. Today's episode is dedicated to competencies, titled Checking a Box or Checking a Skill, the truth about annual competencies. I'm your host, Bobby Parker, and joining me again for this episode, for this season, is Jason Mignatillo, co-star, co-host for the season. Jason, welcome back to the studio.
Thanks, Bobby. Appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to hearing about this exciting topic. It's going to be the meat and potatoes, frankly.
Yeah. Well, exciting is generally not what people say about annual competencies. More like drudgery and pain. It's like, oh no, the competencies are due in 2 weeks. But I agree, it'll be good to dive into this.
Yeah, I think we have the right guest for this, and ultimately, and the reason why I'm excited about it is she's going to show that it doesn't have to be the drudgery, it doesn't have to be the pain. You can think a little bit differently on how to install these or apply these. So I think it's going to be great.
Yeah, for sure. And I know there's a lot of departments that are struggling with this topic. It is, it's one of those things that it's a topic that you'll find at every HSPA show pretty well. There's always somebody talking about competencies because it's so important. So let's anchor this season well and do a good introductory episode to competencies. We'll be right back with our regional educator who's going to talk to us about competencies and how to not make them the drudgery we're describing. We'll be right back after a short break.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now in studio is Tanya Cambise, Allied Health Educational Specialist at Presbyterian Healthcare Services out in New Mexico. Tanya, welcome back to the show. Good to have you back here on the Beyond Clean podcast.
Thank you, Bobby. I'm happy to be here today.
Well, it's been too long. So thank you for saying yes when we reached out about this one. We're definitely excited to talk with you about kind of your unique story out there at Presbyterian and to help give us some context of how to educate technicians, because that's the goal in front of us today. But before we get into that, for those who haven't met you, would love to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've been doing in sterile processing?
So my name's Tanya Cambise. I am like Bobby said, Allied Health Educational Specialist, which is a mouthful. Shorter AKA answers, I'm a sterile processing educator. And I've been in this role about 7 years. I kind of grew up in sterile processing for the last 13 years, went from a technician to a supervisor to a manager, and now in the education role. So I've been kind of a little bit everywhere. My background is actually veterinary. So I was a registered veterinary technician before I came over to sterile processing. Super. And I never turned back. So
yeah. Super cool. Now, some people may wonder about the title Allied Health Educational Specialist. What is that about? Why doesn't it say SPD educator?
So I am part of a larger clinical education department. And so allied health are typically the roles outside of nursing. So you think of respiratory therapists, your scrub techs, sterile processing techs, those are all allied health roles. And so that's kind of where I sit in the grand scheme of things for the clinical education department.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So the other thing that I thought was really interesting about your story is that progression that you talked about from being a technician, a supervisor, a manager, and then a system educator. What was it that made you want to pursue sterile processing education as the next step in your career, having been a department manager?
So for me, I was always really tied into our regional facility. So even as a manager, I would go out and do site visits when asked. And so this was just kind of a natural progression to be able to take what I do and do it on a larger scale. So being able to help kind of the broader picture for the organization.
Yeah. So rather than just the handful of technicians that you had, that you were responsible for educating, like you get to spread that to a bigger impact into a region. That's really cool. Well, great. So Tanya, the emphasis that we want to try to drive towards in today's episode has to do with education and annual competencies. And I knew that we should definitely talk with you with that system level experience as an educator, because you've got a lot of technicians that you're onboarding and bringing in through orientation. You also have a lot of technicians that, on an annual basis need to be, compliantly kept competent. And so I wanted to pick your brain on competencies today. So why don't you get us started here at the top of the call, just at the level of definitions. We talk a lot about annual competencies. Could you define what it is that those annual competencies are? And I guess maybe more particularly what they're not.
All right. So I think whenever we look at definitions, I always like to point back to the AAMI guidelines because they really guide a lot of what we do. And they have some great definitions in there regarding what a competency is. And so at a certain level, this is really about combining the knowledge, skills, and abilities for the individual that we are determining if they're competent in a particular kind of skill. And that's kind of like competency as a whole, but then there's also the competency verification. So competency is that they're competent in doing the skill, but competency verification is where we go in and choose a method to determine how they're competent. And one of the things that we kind of look at is following more of the Donna Wright principles for her approach to competency validation, and that we're not pigeonholing ourselves into just a return demonstration. We can also do case studies. We do a lot of evidence of daily work, which is the individual demonstrating what they do on a daily basis, and we're just documenting it. Mock events, quality audits, those return demonstrations are obviously there, but then also testing. So you kind of have the two different aspects where it's competency and the verification of that competency.
Very cool. Well, thank you for starting us off with that traditional definition. And I think it is a helpful one to distinguish between what competency looks like and then what we're doing is more of a competency verification. You probably had some people hitting pause and pulling Google out when you said a Donna Wright method of evaluation or assessment. Do you want to help us define that? Because that's not a term that I've thought about as an SPD manager doing competencies.
Yeah, it's certainly. So being part of the clinical education department, we look to individuals within the industry to kind of help guide us in what we're doing for our competencies. So Donna Wright does a lot of work with competencies for nursing. So naturally, those same methods can then be extrapolated for sterile processing, especially in the methods, because she talks about, the evidence of daily work that I talked about, where you can document those things that they're doing every day just by looking at the work that they're doing. So if you have a tray, you can review the tray afterwards, and that demonstrates their competence because you're looking at all the things that they should be doing in that tray and verifying. Other things are your quality audits. So you could look at, if you are a department that is tracking errors, how are those errors trending? If they're trending low in an area, you may not have to do competency in that area because you're doing well. However, if you have areas that are suddenly spiking, that's a great area to kind of focus on.
Yeah. So it may not necessarily be every task that a person performs needs to be documented every year or something like that, but specific to what the needs of the department are, what the needs of that technician are, and then what the different methods are for evaluating. As you're talking, I'm thinking about the checklist that we had for competencies when I was leading a department before working with Beyond Clean. And to be honest, it was the same dusty old competency checklist that we'd used for the last 15 years. And they're probably still using it there today, where we just, when it was competency season, we'd, pull everybody together and do one-on-one kind of questionnaire quiz style to make sure they still know how to locate all the fire extinguishers and they, can speak to what all the different bays and decontamination in the sinks are used for and so on. But, came to discover later, and it sounds like more of what you're describing, that there is a much broader definition and scope of what's possible with annual competencies. It doesn't have to be that painful hour-long review with employees at competency season every year, but could be something more dynamic and useful. Jason, you're also working on this at the system level, in a little bit of a different spot. Anything that you would color in or add to Tanya's definition?
No, I was just about to say that's kind of along the lines of what we're utilizing with our regional educator, and pretty awesome. Again, using the Donna Wright model, you can actually use some, the variations of that, but it does take, those local facility leaders actually diving into that. So are they doing those audits? Are they doing those checkbacks, those feedback loops? So it starts with, one, establishing that, but then two, what is the expectation of those leaders? So it's not just cool, annual competencies, go check off the list, but could it be done over a 6-month period so that you're not scrambling to complete by the end of the year, which, sounds like was going on with your world there, Bobby, of, hey, all right, it's due in 2 weeks, everyone go.
Yep.
So yeah, speaking of that and speaking more practically, Tanya, what are in your vision of this, and more importantly, what the requirements are? What is the bare minimum requirement of the best practice for annual competencies? What does that look like?
So I think, again, if you review the AAMI guidelines, I know that the AAMI ST79 is currently being, renovated or whatever you want to call it. The AAMI ST91 guidelines, being that they're fairly new, newer than definitely the ST79 guidelines, they have some great information in there. If you just do a keyword search of competence, I want to say it's around 40 different mentions in this particular guideline versus just a handful in the ST79. And it really does line out things. Now, granted, it is specifically for flexible scopes, but you can, again, extrapolate that to expand to all of sterile processing, where it talks about definitely having annual competencies, but then also ongoing competencies. And so there's a couple different ways that you can look at as far as the bare minimum. I would think at a bare minimum, if you don't have anything else going on, maybe break your department into core areas. So maybe that's decon, assembly, sterilization. And then if you do have flexible scopes, have that as another core area and have some sort of competency within each of those areas. It doesn't necessarily mean that the competency has to be the same every year. So for example, with the flexible scopes, maybe you're focusing on the cleaning verification one year. Maybe you're focusing on the cleaning another year, or drying. So you can kind of break it up and make it meaningful for your area based on what you need, but really focusing on that at a minimum, you're really kind of looking at each area individually and having that as kind of your bare minimum that you do.
So you're advocating for an area competency, which is awesome. I think that's great. Again, that allows for a little bit of variation and variety from year to year. But then I got a question around, so then how do you help with the conversation when it comes to our lovely regulatory partners when it comes to, it says, this person knows how to do this reprocessing of this device annually, or the IFUs need to be followed. So how do you reconcile that?
So I think a lot of that is going to be based on what your hospital policies state around competencies. So always look there, because a lot of times they are going to specify a particular policy. Say if you have one for decontamination, it may specify in there, and you may not know until you look, that you need annual competency there. So I always say start at your hospital policy level, look at your regulatory bodies. Obviously that's EME for us. So for EME ST91, it is stating we should have annual education competency around flexible scopes. Doesn't necessarily say that in ST79, but then there's also, I think, just from a Joint Commission and DNB point of view, they want to see that ongoing competency. So having some sort of competency every year, but just keep in mind that when we look at kind of the hierarchy of how Joint Commission looks at things, your instructions for use are going to be the highest. So we always need to be following those. And a lot of times our policies are going to state that. So we do need to provide some sort of education. Doesn't always have to be education, but some sort of education around those IFUs. Then it's going to be your industry guidelines. So AME guidelines for us, ARN, AST, any of those. And then finally, it's your policies. So you always have to follow your policies, but the highest level is going to be that instructions for use.
Very well said.
Yeah. And you've been through quite a few of these accreditation surveys, I imagine, given the number of years of service that you've been in sterile processing. Anything that you've learned along the way, keeping competency documentations about what that surveyor wants to see, doesn't really care to see when it comes to annual competency and training for your team members?
So I think in general, for any of the regulatory bodies that are going to be visiting, again, they're going to want to see that ongoing education. So they don't want to just see that you have done your orientation paperwork and that's it. We do need to really focus on those annual competencies. In general, I've never seen them specifically call out a specific competency. They're just looking overall when they pull that employee file. Do they have something in their file that is on an ongoing basis rather than a specific skill?
Gotcha.
Are there any commonly overlooked skills or practices that you would say from your perspective from the regulatory partners that have been called out?
So I think we've talked a lot about instructions for use, and I always find it amusing that no matter what conversation you're having, it always comes up. But for me, it's not just about the instructions for use. Can you locate it? It's the actual comprehension of those IFUs in the background. So I think, having individuals being able to not only locate them, but understand exactly what it's telling you or not. Because we all know that our instructions for use are not always that great, and they are very complex, but it's that kind of interpretation that we're missing for, I think, a lot of the sterile processing techs that are just doing the day in, day out. And so that's where we may have to help them as educators, managers, and other roles to be able to kind of make it easier for them to understand what it actually is calling out in those specific IFUs.
Yeah, and to have the tools and confidence to go to those IFUs and be able to interpret them and read them. Having the file cabinet or the digital library of IFUs and kind of checking the box saying like, we've got that covered, we paid our subscription. Like, yeah, that's not competence with IFUs. So yeah, it's a good one to call out. You mentioned that annual competencies could look like having, maybe some different buckets or categories of training with respect to decontamination and assembly. And then within those categories, training might look different from one year to the next. How do you decide as the educator or the operational leader in the department what things to focus on each year? Are there any best practices around deciding which ones need a competency and which ones are just kind of SPD common sense that we trained on once and we don't revisit it for a long time?
So I think for that particular question, you kind of have to, again, go back to what your hospital policies are going to state. Because if they do outline that a competency is needed, I think where you can take a little bit of leeway with that is determining which competency is actually needed. Because, decon is a big topic, but there's a lot of nuances within decon. And maybe you are doing just some audits in there, just some quick check-ins, things of that nature, and you're finding that certain steps are being missed. That's a great place to kind of start. So you've done that gap analysis. So you have how we should be taught, and then, what is actually happening. So that gap in between, that's a great place to kind of start with the competency, especially if you're seeing that it's widespread. So you have kind of that process drift. Other things that you can think about is, again, going back to quality. Are you getting any sort of metrics or data behind what you're doing? Are you seeing in particular that the OR maybe is flagging a particular instrument for bioburden? Or maybe it's assembled and it should be disassembled. These are, again, great things to kind of keep in mind of areas that you can do those competencies in. Kind of, again, gives you leeway within those buckets to kind of figure out what is actually needed for that competency validation.
It's reminding me of a tour I took through a VA hospital one time, Tanya, and you know how it is in some of those facilities, like very, very highly regulated environment. They get surveyors in there much more frequently than just a traditional hospital. And so their documentation, they put a lot of resources into making sure it was really good. This particular facility that I went to, they had a risk assessment on just about every process that they did in the department and gave it a score on its risk based on the likelihood of an error, the impact to the patient if they did have an error, the frequency with which they processed the thing, which contributed to the likelihood of an error, and gave it a score. And then they used those risk scores to decide how frequently they're going to educate on it. So some things were on a cycle of every 3 months. Some things were we're going to educate it on yearly. Some were on every 3-year cycle just because it was pretty low risk. And then they used that calendar to determine their annual competencies. And I was blown away with the amount of paperwork that went into that process. But I did also love and appreciate the structure, that what they were doing is exactly what you're describing is, what are those items that are likely to cause a problem for us, either because they're low volume or they're high risk, or maybe they're brand new to the department, and making sure that we hit those items at least on an annual basis and have some documented training for each of the team members. I think is a really good way to do it.
Yeah, and kind of tying into that, again, going back to Donna Wright, she has multiple books about competency validation and verification. And she does talk about when you look at your competencies as a group, looking at them as, that kind of high and low risk. If there is something that's problematic, it's changed. There's multiple different categories that she has, and kind of putting a check mark in each one regarding what is going on. And when you have so many check marks, and you would kind of develop this process as a group, whether that's within your clinical education department or even within sterile processing, but you look at that topic and you start putting check marks in these columns, and the more you get, so if it's problematic and high risk, maybe that automatically is a competency.
Yeah.
Whereas maybe it's problematic and low risk, maybe that's a tip sheet or that's an in-service from a rep. So there's different ways that you can look at kind of those competencies, and kind of tying in what you were talking about with that risk score. That's amazing. Love that. Kind of leads me back to Peter Nickel and his article that he talked about looking at the risk and overall in sterile processing for the whole process start to finish. He looked at the risk of error for every single step, all 104 that he outlined for a basic instrument. And, it comes down to a lot of the visualization steps are going to be the highest risk. So maybe you have the same kind of thing with competencies around assembly, like those visualization tasks, being a high risk area, like maybe those are always kind of on a topic to have a competency.
Yeah. You mentioned having a vendor potentially come in and help with education. Maybe it's a tip sheet or an in-service. as we're thinking about competencies, like I don't want to give the impression at the end of this call that the only way to have compliant annual competencies is to have like this a dedicated educator with this really well-defined risk assessment, because it's just not a reality for the majority of our listeners. A lot of times it's, the one manager or sometimes the one supervisor and their 12 techs, and they're just trying to figure out how to make it happen. And like we've carved out some helpful lines to identify like what maybe to lean into for competency. But when it comes time to actually document and do those competencies, who's allowed to be involved in that? Like, is it okay to lean on a vendor to do some competency around a particular thing if they're signing off on a sheet? Does that live with the leader? Or maybe can you involve peers in doing competencies? Like what is best practice there?
So I think for that particular question, it really depends how you want to structure your competency program. Maybe it's a train the trainer type of program where you as a manager or supervisor or, whoever's kind of leading the department, maybe you dedicate a couple technicians that are helping with this process. So you essentially provide the training to them, then they're deemed competent and they go out and they actually do all the competency. So that's one model. Vendors can be helpful in the competency validation process, but it's really going to depend on what type of vendor you have. We all have those vendors that come in that they do our in-services and they can barely use the piece of equipment that they're speaking about. Those are not the ones you laugh, but we've all had those vendors. But those are probably not the ones you're going to want to lean on to do a competency validation. Not to call out any specific group, but there is one that'll come in for flexible scopes and they have a checklist. And they have the person go step by step by step based on the IFU. I'm going to feel more comfortable with that than a vendor that's just kind of coming in willy-nilly and providing education, but it's only covering part of what we do with that equipment or that instrument. So I think it's going to be you having to kind of vet those vendors a little bit if you do lean on them. Now, peers are also a great group of individuals that can sign off in others, but you do want to make sure, that you validate them first before they kind of go out, because you do want to make sure that the practices that they're doing are the ones that you want them to then go watch others do. So you don't want to have the ones that have the bad practices or those things that you don't want to kind of then spread being the ones that are signing off, because they should be coaching in the moment if something's not right, and you don't want them to kind of lead people down the wrong path.
Tanya, if I could just add on, and I agree with you completely of being able to utilize your vendors more from an education perspective, I would caution just make sure that anybody listening to this, make sure you also look at your policies. So there may be a policy that prevents you from using a vendor to do the sign-off process. Yeah, Tanya did call out me laughing because there are those ones that, how do we know what they're doing, right? So, and actually, if you follow up with some vendors, you ask the question, how do you know your sales rep that's performing this quote unquote in service has actually been educated and competencied? And funny enough, they actually don't have any sign off. So you got to be very cautious. You definitely got to vet that. And I do want to, again, caution listeners that don't just follow the vendor telling you that. Make sure that one, you have vetted them, and two, they are competent to provide your team that competency. So good call out, Tanya.
Well said. Well, as we're drawing this conversation to a close, Tanya, I want to give you the last word here for some help and encouragement to those departments who, it's the leader and their 12 techs. And what they've been doing right now is just the bare minimum. They have a checklist that they run through that's, let's say, 10 check boxes long that says they know how to decontaminate instruments, check. And they check it off every year and keep it in the file folder. What do you think is a realistic next step for them to move from that model to one that really is improving the skills of their team around training and annual competencies and not just meeting a compliance measure?
Awesome. I know for myself, just know you're not alone if you've been in that kind of space, especially moving into the role that I'm in now. It was building a program from scratch. And it sounds daunting, but you have to start somewhere. And so there's something in our procedural educator group that we always talk about. And it's our kind of group motto that this is a marathon, not a sprint. That's kind of the mentality that we talk about in education, that you're here for the long haul, and that's more important than trying to push things out too quickly. So one thing to keep in mind is if you're starting from like nothing, or you have, like you said, Bobby, that one checklist of 10 items, choose one of those topics or any topic and start there and kind of develop the steps that you want to validate your techs on. So looking at, assembly, maybe there's certain areas that are more challenging, like forgetting our chemical indicators on the trays. Start kind of with that assembly process. Like, what does that look like? Do you or have it on the checklist to say, remove all instruments from the tray, wipe it down, inspect for any sort of contamination, and then immediately place those indicators in, and really outlining those best practices, as well as kind of helping to set the process in place for people to have that error happen less often. But just start somewhere. And over time, you can really build something that's going to be meaningful and sustainable and truly reflective of what your department needs are. But it doesn't happen overnight. It takes that time to kind of build it and to grow it and to figure out what does and does not work for your team.
Yeah, nothing worth building ends up getting built overnight. So thanks for that encouragement, Tanya. And like all things in SPD for improvement, it does take that continuous improvement, like you said, and having the courage to just get started and make it 5% better than last year's competencies is the way forward. Well, Tanya, great interview. Thanks again for agreeing to come on the show. I am certain there will be some folks who want to continue to talk about this topic of competencies and hear more about how you've built what you've built across multiple facilities. So if anybody wanted to get in touch with you, is LinkedIn the best way to do that?
Yes, LinkedIn would definitely be the best way.
Okay, well, there you have it. Ask all of your competency questions Tanya's way. Tanya, thanks again for joining us on the show today. Great job on the interview.
Thank you for having me.
And that was Tanya Cambise, Allied Health Educational Specialist 3 at Presbyterian Healthcare Services out in New Mexico. And Jason, I think this episode was really important. Competencies are one of those things that we've been talking about since forever. 30 years from now, we're still going to be talking about them just because they're that important to patient care. And knowing how to do them well in a way that's not just a checkbox, but really does provide value to your team members, I think is kind of the bedrock of what this season is about. So was really glad that we got to dive into some definitions and some methods, and hopefully gave our listeners some homework to think through as they look at their own competency programs. One of the things that we talked about there at the end was how to get started if you're, in a smaller department managing competencies and building out one from scratch. One that I wish we had time for, and I'd like your opinion on as well, is what it's like stepping into a system educator role, where now you have all these facilities with their own idea of what competencies look like, and you've got to figure out how to bring them all together. I know that you've, walked in at least some form of those shoes. Do you have any advice for that person who's like brand new system educator, and like, where do you go from here with competencies?
Yeah, well, hopefully you've got some competencies that are working already within the system. So things first is, don't be a bull in a china shop and go in and just start wrecking things. Find out who those really strong leaders are within the region. Find out what they've got kind of built. And then from there, I would highly recommend kind of sitting down with everybody in the region and coming to a consensus and creating those consensus documents. From there, then it's more of a train the trainer situation. You as an individual can't get to every site in your market, system, region.